Hey, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of American Criminal. In this season, a pair of criminals form a special bond and go on a cross-country killing spree. Or do they? Listen to American Criminal, Serial Killers, Serial Liars, wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get ad-free access to the entire season first, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.
It's October 9th, 1980, in Nashville, Tennessee. A 25-year-old man rushes to the American Airlines check-in counter in the south concourse of the Nashville International Airport. He carries a dark-colored suitcase. Good afternoon. How can I help you? I have a flight to New York. Looks like you're running a little late. Yes, I am. Well, to make your flight and get your luggage on board, you'll need to self-check your suitcase upstairs in the security line. With a groan, the young man heads upstairs and waits in line to get through airport security. He puts his suitcase on the conveyor belt and steps through the metal detector without incident. He waits for his suitcase to come through the X-ray machine. But when it finally does, it's quickly grabbed and opened. Before the man even knows what's happening, security officers descend upon him. Sir, are you aware you have 3 guns and a box of ammunition in your suitcase? The young man tries to remain calm, but he's struggling. Yes, I bought them for friends. You bought 3 guns and ammunition for friends? Yes, for friends at Yale. I go to Yale. The young man tries to plead his case. He tries to defend having a .38 caliber revolver, 2 .22 caliber pistols, and a box of high-velocity hollow-point cartridges in his bag. But the security officers aren't buying it. Sir, come with me. Please, I've done nothing wrong. We'll see about that. One of the airport security officers puts in a call to the FBI, but the FBI didn't want any part of it. Agents instructed the security officers to handle the incident through local authorities. After confiscating the weapons, the local police took the man to the Nashville Metro Jail. Judge William E. Higgins set bail at $62.50 and then told the man to appear in court on October 14th. The young man posted bail and went on his way, but he never appeared in court. What airport security, Nashville police, and the FBI did not realize is that the man they arrested, John Warnick Hinckley Jr., came to Nashville with the intent to assassinate President Jimmy Carter. Though Hinckley intended to kill him during Carter's speech at the Grand Ole Opry, he lost the nerve to go through with his plans. 6 months later, he would find his resolve and open fire on newly elected President Ronald Reagan. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. John Hinckley would later tell one of his therapists that he lost interest in Carter, but that when Reagan became president, his interest was reignited. His initial plan to kill Carter and his later plan to kill Reagan both stem from the desire to garner attention from a young actress named Jodie Foster. Hinckley had become obsessed with Foster ever since seeing her play the role of Iris in Martin Scorsese's 1976 film Taxi Driver. Foster had been 12 years old when the movie was shot. Hinckley had gone so far in his infatuation as to take up residence for a time in New Haven, Connecticut, where Foster enrolled as a freshman at Yale. But his attempts to win Foster's attention by calling her directly and delivering poems to her New Haven home had failed. On March 30th, 1981, Hinckley concocted a plan to finally get Jodie Foster to notice him. At 12:45 p.m. on a rainy day in Washington, D.C., Hinckley sat down in room 312 of the Park Central Hotel and wrote what would be his final letter to Foster. In the note, scrawled on yellow paper in the hotel room, Hinckley wrote, "By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind about me. Jodie, I'm asking you to please look into your heart and at least give me the chance with this historical deed to gain your respect and love." After finishing the letter, John Hinckley calmly left the Park Central Hotel, hailed a cab, and made his way to the Washington Hilton Hotel, where President Ronald Reagan had just given a speech. After having his firearms confiscated in Nashville, Hinckley had traveled to Dallas and purchased 2 more .22 caliber pistols at Rocky's pawn shop. He clutched one of those pistols tightly at his side as he arrived at the Hilton. Hinckley quickly joined an unscreened crowd only 15 feet from where the president would exit the hotel to cross to his limousine. At approximately 2:27 p.m., Reagan made his way out of the Hilton through the President's Walk, waved to shouting fans, and tried to make out questions from reporters. Hinckley knew this was his best chance. He raised his gun and took aim at Reagan. In the span of 1.7 seconds, Hinckley fired 6 shots, injuring Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy, police officer Thomas Delante, and White House press secretary James Brady. Reagan survived, but it was a close call. One of Hinckley's final shots ricocheted off the president's limousine and hit the president under the left arm, breaking a rib and puncturing his left lung. This attempt on Reagan's life only bolstered his popularity with the people, and it added to the already growing myth of Reagan's political and personal invincibility. On the campaign trail in 1984, President Reagan would prove to the who's who of Washington that he was worthy of the nickname they had given him. This is episode 50, 1984, Reagan versus Mondale, the Teflon president. John Hinckley's assassination attempt came on only the 69th day of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Reagan had been elected by a huge margin over Jimmy Carter in 1980, and the president had remained incredibly popular with the people throughout his first 2 months in the White House. Hinckley's bullet did not cut into the president's popularity. It only bolstered it. In the hospital, recovering from his wounds, Reagan was caught joking with his wife Nancy. By greeting her with, "Honey, I forgot to duck," he demonstrated all of the charm and humor that had made him a beloved public figure for decades. However, the injuries and recovery time did raise questions about Reagan's health and age. At the time, Reagan was the oldest person ever elected to the presidency, and some started to wonder if he would be able to serve 2 terms. Lying in a bed at George Washington Hospital, Reagan's future in the White House seemed vulnerable for the first time. After his recovery, Democrats went on the attack. They pointed to the flagging economy and growing disparity between rich and poor to paint Reagan as a classist who was out of touch with the American worker. Democrats highlighted the struggles of the black community to demonstrate that Reaganomics, as his economic plan had been dubbed, only benefited wealthy white Americans. And they used the country's growing tension with the Soviet Union to suggest Reagan was failing in foreign affairs. These attacks paid off, and in the 1982 midterm elections, the Democrats gained 27 seats in the House of Representatives, winning the popular vote for the House by almost 12 points. Democrats only picked up 1 seat in the Senate, but made several races across the country far closer than anyone expected. So they figured if they could create the right blueprint and find the right candidate, the Democrats might be able to make a real run for the White House in 1984. Shortly after the midterms, it became clear who that candidate should be. An early national poll put the presumptive Democratic frontrunner, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, 6 points ahead of President Reagan. But Ted Kennedy, the younger brother of the late President John F. Kennedy, was a journeyman politician, and his famous last name came with a long, complicated history rife with political scandal. So to reclaim the White House, Democrats would set out to put Ted Kennedy's past scandals behind him and mount a campaign that could unseat Reagan and stem the tide of the conservative movement in America. First, though, they would have to convince Kennedy to run at all. It's Friday, November 26, 1982, the day after Thanksgiving. Ted Kennedy and his family have spent the holiday at the 6-acre Kennedy compound on Cape Cod in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. They've whiled away the days taking the boat out, wandering the beach, and enjoying the seclusion the compound provides. But on Friday evening, Ted calls his family and trusted advisors Larry Horowitz and speechwriter Bob Shrum to discuss his potential run for president. All right, Larry, make your case. Well, based on recent polls and economic projections, I think there's a path not only to win the nomination, but to take the White House. You sure this isn't just wishful thinking, Larry? Well, it won't be easy, but it is possible. We'll focus early on Iowa, travel the state by car with Senator Hughes. We'll get a guy like Tim Russert to handle the national press, and we let John Sasso run things for us in New Hampshire. That should allow us to shift our focus after Iowa to making a serious run in the South, and we already have support from Wallace. In an attempt to put his past behind him, former Alabama governor and well-known segregationist George Wallace recently reached out to the Kennedy camp and offered to help with ground game in the South. Are we sure we want Wallace's help? We can't win without the South. The South is key. If we win the South, no one can stop us. All right. So if Larry's to believe, we should start planning the inauguration now, but I want to hear from the family. After a quick exchange with his sisters Jean Smith and Patricia Lawford, Ted turns to Steve Smith, his brother-in-law and former campaign strategist for his brother, John F. Kennedy. "Well, I respect Larry's optimism, but this'll be a hell of a fight. All the family history, Chappaquiddick, it's all going to come up again." The word Chappaquiddick makes Ted Kennedy wince. Back in 1969, Kennedy's negligence in a drunk driving accident resulted in the death of a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne. Kennedy pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, fleeing from the scene of an accident. And though he got off light with a suspended jail sentence, the Chappaquiddick incident dogged him as a candidate in his failed bid for the 1980 Democratic nomination. But Ted has never let Chappaquiddick define him, and he's less concerned about confronting the scandal again, and more concerned with the opinions of the three people whom he loves more than any other. After listening to advice from his extended family and advisors, Ted asks for the room. "Well, thank you, everyone, but if you don't mind, I'd like to speak with my children, privately." The group files out and leaves Ted alone with his three children, 22-year-old Cara, 21-year-old Ted Jr., and 15-year-old Patrick. "Now, don't worry about anything they just said. I want you to be completely honest with me. What do you think I should do? Should I run for president?" Cara, the eldest of Kennedy's children, quickly recounts a story from Kennedy's previous campaign. "Well, remember, Dad, we were at a speaking event. I was going to go up on stage with you. Then a man got in my face and yelled, 'Your father killed a girl about your age.' He was so furious. I didn't know what to do, and I don't know if I can go through with that sort of stuff again." Ted Jr. follows his sister's lead. "Yeah, it was hard for the family. The ridicule in the news, the strain it put on your relationship with Mom, and the three of us being constantly afraid. You don't need to be afraid. We won't let anything happen to you on the campaign." "We're not afraid for ourselves, Dad." "Well, I don't understand." "Dad, it's obvious. We're afraid someone's going to kill you, like they killed your brothers." The final remark hangs in the room. The assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy are not often brought up by Ted's children. He takes Cara, Ted Jr., and Patrick in. It's obvious what they want him to do. Ted makes his decision. "All right, and that's it." After excusing himself from the room, Ted Kennedy spent some time alone staring out over the water. When he was ready, he called on speechwriter Bob Shrum. Handing Shrum a glass of vodka, Teddy told him to get to work on a statement. By the time they left Hyannis Port, the entire Kennedy family and his closest advisors knew of Ted's decision, and it wouldn't be long before the American people learned the news, and the Democrats learned that their party was bereft of a frontrunner. On December 1st, 1982, in the small hearing room of the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources in the Dirksen Office Building in D.C., Ted Kennedy officially announced that he would not seek the presidency in 1984, nor would he accept an offer to run as vice president. He made it clear that he did not want to put his family through another grueling campaign. Believing he could take better care of his children and accomplish more from his position in the Senate, Ted Kennedy exited the presidential primary. His decision almost instantly threw the Democrats into a panic. Upon hearing the news about Kennedy, Ohio Democratic Chairman Paul Tipp said, "This is the first time since 1968 that we've had the frontrunner drop out. This creates tremendous opportunities and tremendous vacuums." House Speaker Tip O'Neill, who had learned of Kennedy's decision prior to the press conference, simply stated he was surprised as hell. But party leaders had to quickly move past their shock and disappointment that a potential return to a Kennedy Camelot was not going to happen. In Kennedy, they had at least a viable candidate who could go toe-to-toe with President Reagan. But with one simple press conference, they had been deprived of their best hope. Party platforms, policy initiatives, and blueprints for a winning campaign all took a backseat to a single question: who could beat Ronald Reagan? As 1982 came to an end, it was obvious the Democrats had no real answer. In early February of 1983, the Democratic primary started to take on the complexion of the Republican primary of 1980, when a crowded primary field of candidates caused the moderates and conservatives to clash over how the party should move forward. As candidates made their official announcements and outlined their platforms, it became increasingly clear the Democratic Party was splintering along ideological and generational lines. On one side stood the old-line New Deal Democrats. With Kennedy gone, most of them wanted former Vice President Walter Mondale to lead the party forward. His only real challenger seemed to be former astronaut turned Ohio Senator John Glenn. Civil rights activist Jesse Jackson entered the race too. And while Mondale didn't perceive Jackson as a long-term threat, he did believe Jackson could give any candidate a run for his money in a range of southern states. Opposing these New Deal Democrats was a group of younger politicians who would become known as neoliberals, but at the time were more commonly called Atari Democrats. Named after the gaming system that had invaded American homes in the 70s and 80s, this group believed that the tech industry would shape the future of American culture and economics. At first, no one of this younger generation of Democrats stepped forward to challenge Mondale and the party establishment. Until, on February 17th of 1983, a little-known senator from Colorado named Gary Hart announced his candidacy. Hart was barely on the political radar, but he would quickly become the face of the Atari Democrats and the clearest obstacle for Mondale. Hart, who was 9 years younger than Mondale, positioned himself as the future of the party, while Mondale was its past. In speeches and campaign literature, Hart stated plainly, America must decide whether to move forward or stand still. Hart knew if he had any chance to break through the crowded field, he would have to perform well in Iowa. And at the time, Mondale wasn't focused on Hart at all. Instead, Mondale was trying to separate himself from Senator Glenn, and by almost all accounts, his efforts were successful. In covering the primaries for the Minneapolis Tribune, Finlay Lewis wrote about Mondale, he had more people in more places across Iowa's 99 counties than his competitors. His campaign was richer, better engineered, better manned, more imaginative by far than the effort of his nearest rival in the polls, Senator John Glenn of Ohio. That impressive ground game paid dividends for Mondale, and when the votes were cast, it wasn't even close. Mondale won the Iowa caucus with 48.9% of the vote. Glenn finished a disappointing sixth, even trailing the vote of those who were uncommitted. Jesse Jackson, whose campaign had yet to make significant headway, left Iowa with only 2% of the vote. Mondale called it the sweetest primary in history and saw his path to the nomination as a swift and easy one. But if Mondale had been paying closer attention, he would have noticed some troubling signs. Gary Hart, who had barely registered in early polls, managed a second-place finish in Iowa, and not all of the reporting surrounding Mondale was glowing. Richard Cohen of the Washington Post wrote, "There is something missing. Call it enthusiasm, call it emotion. The Mondale campaign walks, talks, and acts like the dominant frontrunner. It just doesn't feel like one. Instead of excitement, there's a sense of duty or obligation about this campaign." In addition to putting Hart on the map, the results in Iowa knocked Senator John Glenn's campaign completely off course. He would remain in the primary for a little while longer, but his campaign was fading fast. Hart used Glenn's failure and his own surprise showing to declare the primary a two-person race between him and Mondale. Hart's confidence coming out of Iowa seemed to be contagious, and soon the anyone but Mondale crowd began to coalesce around him. These Atari Democrats were younger, highly educated, and wealthier than much of Mondale's base. They expressed a growing sense of disappointment in the tried and true doctrines of the Democratic Party. They wanted new ideas and new approaches, and they saw Gary Hart as the man who could move the party into the future. In late February of 1983, with Iowa behind them, the Democratic candidates would set their sights on New Hampshire. Gary Hart would attempt to mount one of the largest upsets in Democratic primary history, trying to rouse his slowly growing base and exploit the cracks he saw in the Mondale campaign. While the former vice president would, by some accounts, grow complacent after Iowa, Hart would pour all of his energy into New Hampshire in an attempt to prove that if the Granite State was ready for a major shift in the character of the Democratic Party, the rest of the country would be too. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. On February 26, 1984 in Nashua, New Hampshire, just 2 days before the primary, Walter Mondale appeared to be coasting through the campaign. After his dominant showing in Iowa, he was already viewed by much of the national media and the DNC as the presumptive nominee. But Gary Hart believed he could still change that narrative by making a strong showing in New Hampshire. Hart tried to meet with as many people as he possibly could, and he left the impression with voters that he was someone who actually listened to their concerns. On that day of the 26th of February, he hosted a town hall in Nashua. He hoped to present himself as the only logical candidate to take on Ronald Reagan. Still, Hart fully accepted that he was the underdog in the primary, as evidenced by the local marching band that played a slightly off-key rendition of the theme from Rocky as Hart entered the town hall meeting. In front of the enthusiastic crowd, Hart talked at length about how 1984 was a turning point for the country. He boiled down the primary and presidential elections to a simple statement: the issue before the American people is our future or our past. Hart had built his campaign on the idea that he could move the country forward. For the most part, it had been a tactic to set himself apart from Walter Mondale. But in his Nashua town hall, Gary Hart all but ignored Mondale. Instead, he went directly after President Ronald Reagan. He attacked the president and the Republican Party for being a group that only cared about wealthy white Americans. He spoke about the need for an economy that provided opportunities for all Americans, regardless of race, gender, or class. Hart's ability to connect the economy to pressing social issues started to garner the attention of the progressive wing of the party, as well as the moderates. There were some moderate Democrats who believed the party had wrongfully chosen special interest groups and minority causes over the needs of white working-class Americans. In New Hampshire, Hart started to bridge the gap between Democratic voters. He was focused on progressive social issues, but not at the cost of middle-class Americans who were struggling to make ends meet. Hart finished his town hall with a direct strike at the president, saying, "Ronald Reagan outrages me when he claims to love his country and hates our government, and I want to get rid of a president who hates the government of the United States." Hart's closing remarks were met with thunderous applause. He may have been the underdog in the race, but there was a large contingent of Nashua voters in that town hall meeting who pledged their support and believed Hart could pull off a seemingly impossible upset on primary day and beat Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale, though, wasn't concerned. He'd set himself apart from the field in Iowa and believed no one could challenge him moving forward. What Mondale and much of the national news media failed to see was that Gary Hart was making an impact on the ground in New Hampshire. Hart's campaign in the Granite State was led by future New Hampshire Governor and Senator Jean Shaheen. Shaheen had created a strong organization around her candidate, and she put a blueprint in place to ensure Hart had ample opportunity to connect with the young voters that he saw as his base, while also attending events heavily populated with older, middle-class voters who on paper were more likely to support Mondale. At a lumberjack field day event in Berlin, New Hampshire, Gary Hart had even entered an axe-throwing contest. His second throw, which was caught on camera, hit the bullseye, and the man from out west quickly gained the respect of all the New Englanders on hand. In the day leading up to the primary vote, TV channels across the state showed Gary Hart throwing that axe and countless other clips of him casually walking and talking with the people of New Hampshire. And yet still, Walter Mondale was not concerned. Mondale was up by an average of 17 points over Hart in the polls, and many major news outlets in the country continued to talk about him as if he'd already won the nomination. On February 28, 1984, the day of the New Hampshire primary, the New York Times released an article that simply stated, "Walter F. Mondale now holds the most commanding lead ever recorded in a presidential nominating campaign by a non-incumbent." New Hampshire voters, though, must have missed the message that the race was already over, because when the results came in on Election Day, Gary Hart had won 41% of the vote to Mondale's 29%. Hart's stunning victory in New Hampshire would go down as one of the biggest upsets in Democratic primary history. It shocked Mondale and his entire team, prompting the former vice president to say, Sometimes a cold shower is good for you. But Mondale wasn't the only one who was paying attention to Gary Hart. As news of Hart's victory circulated the White House the next day, it's reported that Ronald Reagan and his team scrambled to learn more about the Colorado senator. Reagan staffers worked the phones and tried to set up lunch meetings with contacts to glean whatever information they could. Copies of Gary Hart's book, A New Democracy, circulated among Reagan's staff, most of whom were now impressed and a little bit fearful. As they dove into the data surrounding Hart's win in New Hampshire, they found his supporters came from all walks of life and age groups, and that he had made a strong showing with independent voters. The young, handsome senator from Colorado had broad appeal. This made many Republicans worry that the Democrats had finally answered the question, who can beat Ronald Reagan? Gary Hart followed up his win in New Hampshire with a victory in the Maine caucuses on March 5th and the Vermont primary on March 6th. He'd won 3 New England states within a week, and within that short time span, Walter Mondale's campaign seemingly went from being invincible to being on the brink of collapse. Following his win in Maine, Hart commented at a dinner in Boston that he may have brought a political juggernaut to its knees. While Mondale no longer had the air of inevitability about him, he refused to give in to the idea that his bid for the nomination was over. Instead, he tried to point out that the nominating process had only started and there was still a long way to go. We're going to lose some more, he said, but before this is over, I'm confident I'm going to be out ahead and be nominated. From New England, the primaries headed to the South. Jesse Jackson's campaign started to gather steam, and he begun to make headway in a number of southern states. While most thought Jackson would not garner enough delegates to win the nomination, he could definitely affect the outcome. Hart continued to court young voters, independents, and entrepreneurs, while Mondale tried to shore up support from the vestiges of the New Deal Democrats. Mondale also fought hard in several southern states to gain support of black voters, who many assumed would support Jackson. But as the Mondale camp watched Hart garner more media attention, they knew time was running out. They had to make it clear to the American people that Gary Hart was not a man you could trust in the Oval Office. One Mondale aide would later say, "We tried to play on the issue of character without raising it ourselves. We knew it was there. We knew the press needed a hook. So at a debate prior to the primaries of several southern states, Mondale would give the media the hook they needed." It's March 11, 1984, at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, Georgia. 5 Democratic candidates take their seats on the primary debate stage, but viewers at home and the national media know only 2 of them still have a legitimate chance to win the nomination for president: Gary Hart and Walter Mondale. Mondale has come to Atlanta with one goal: to show the American people that Gary Hart simply isn't qualified to be president. He wastes no time in making his case. Mondale's opening statement is clearly aimed at Hart, even though he doesn't mention the Colorado senator by name.
We don't elect momentum. We don't elect images. We elect a human being. And we better pick someone who knows what he's doing.
John Chancellor, the debate moderator, knows as well as anyone that the story of the primary is Mondale versus Hart. So throughout this debate, he puts the 2 men in direct conflict. Chancellor follows up Mondale's opening statement with a challenge to Hart.
Isn't there some truth to your opponent's charges that your campaign is more impressionistic than theirs? That you are spending more and more time just being Gary Hart than outlining specific things you do if you were elected?
Mondale could not have hoped for a better opening question to Hart. It immediately sets up Hart as a candidate who has no real solutions, a man who is all style, no substance. Hart starts his reply by suggesting that he has laid out his ideas in multiple position papers that he had sent to his opponents, but his real concern is with the fast-paced primary season itself.
The other thing is these primaries are happening awfully fast now, and I oppose the way this calendar was set up. I on the record, in the fall of 1982, told the Hunt Commission and the Democratic National Committee not to do this.
Hart argues that if he had more time to campaign in each state, the American people would have a clearer idea of his specific plans. Later in the debate, Chancellor poses a big question, one that will later be known as the 2 a.m. phone call question, a hypothetical that will be mimicked in future debates.
I want you all to listen to this because you've all thought about sleeping in the White House. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. You're upstairs in that bedroom and you're sound asleep and the phone rings. An airliner from Czechoslovakia, a communist country, enters American airspace on a course directly across some SAC missile bases. It is headed for Colorado Springs and the North American Air Defense Command. American fighters have tried everything they can do to stop it, short of shooting it down, shooting across its bow, all of that. And they look in, the lights are on, and it's full of people. And there you are on the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning. What are you going to do?
Gary Hart answers first.
If the people that they looked in and saw had uniforms on, I'd shoot the aircraft down. If they were civilians, I'd just let it keep going.
Hart has just made a massive mistake, and the other candidates on stage waste no time in letting him know it. Senator John Glenn uses his military background and a little biting humor to illustrate Hart's ignorance.
I hope that I've flown wing on these airplanes, go up peeking in the windows.
With Hart struggling, Mondale sees an opening. He wants people to question Hart's character, and he desperately wants to give the media the hook his campaign thinks they need. Late in the debate, he finds his chance to do just that when Hart talks about his new economic ideas.
But I think there is a fundamental difference, for example, between Vice President Mondale and myself. That is, I think we can meet the basic human needs and commitments of the people of this country by restoring entrepreneurship.
Hart goes on to give what some see as a rambling answer about jobs and minority-owned businesses in the South. Chancellor opens the floor for responses, but Mondale knows this is his moment. He cuts through the noise and cuts Gary Hart down to size with one very memorable line.
When I hear your new ideas, I'm reminded of that ad. Where's the beef?
The reference to the popular Wendy's commercial at the time brought down the House, and it served as the major takeaway from the debate. Mondale would later admit that he'd never seen the Wendy's commercial he was referencing, and that his campaign manager, Bob Beckel, had suggested the line and acted it out for him. But it didn't matter where it came from, the line worked. It got pundits and voters to question whether or not there was any substance to Gary Hart. With a successful debate and strong support from civil rights activist Coretta Scott King, wife of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Walter Mondale picked up the key states of Georgia and Alabama on March 13th. But Mondale knew that the contests in February and March were a long way from the end of the primary. In 1984, the primaries ended on June 12th in North Dakota. There was still plenty of time for Mondale to get back on track as voters got to know the candidates. After the Atlanta debate, the question of where's the beef gathered steam. It became a call for people to look more closely at Gary Hart. Many began to question the man who had suddenly rocketed to national fame and started appearing on the covers of magazines. And as reporters started to dig, questions surrounding Hart's past emerged. He'd been born Gary Hart Pence, so why did he change his name to Hart? Looking at documents over the years, reporters found the style of his signature had changed multiple times. On more than one occasion in his career, Hart had appeared to lie about his age. And as more and more little inconsistencies surfaced, questions began to follow Gary Hart on the campaign trail. By April, Mondale had won Illinois and New York and seemed to be back in the frontrunner seat. But as the primary season barreled through May and into June, Hart, once again the underdog, looked poised for another string of upsets. If he could secure decisive victories in California and New Jersey, two states where he led in the polls, he could make a final push and perhaps win the nomination. After campaigning heavily in New Jersey, Hart traveled to California to join his wife Lee for a fundraiser. At the event, Hart made a joke at the expense of New Jersey. He said he was jealous that his wife had been campaigning on the West Coast while he'd been stuck in Jersey, where the only sights you got to see were samples from toxic waste dumps. The joke played well at the fundraiser, but it had a much different effect when it was shown over and over on newscasts in New Jersey. On June 5, 1984, Gary Hart pulled out a narrow victory in California. In New Jersey, where Hart had been ahead in the polls, Mondale won by 15 points and all but secured the Democratic nomination. On July 12, 1984, Mondale announced New York Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, making her the first female vice presidential candidate for a major party in American history. Ferraro was officially nominated at the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco on July 19th. It was there that Mondale celebrated his defeat of the Atari Democrat Gary Hart and how he held off the neoliberal wave in the Democratic Party. But he knew he couldn't just rely on the old guard Democrats if he hoped to defeat Ronald Reagan. In Ferraro, Mondale saw a chance to prove to those on the left that he was a champion of change and equality, and he hoped Ferraro would attract women voters from both parties and give him a fighting chance to win the White House. As the Associated Press reported, the The usually cautious Walter Mondale has laid down the biggest wager of his political life, gambling that the nomination of Mondale-Ferraro as his running mate will energize and attract more voters than it loses. It is a high-risk strategy designed to upset Ronald Reagan. For more than a year, feminists have been arguing that naming a woman would maximize the gender gap, electrify otherwise indifferent voters, particularly women, and give Mondale the boost he needs to overcome what some polls say is now a 19-point Reagan margin. Mondale and Ferraro would mount their attack on President Ronald Reagan, trying to paint him as an out-of-touch old man who cared only about rich Americans. For their part, Reagan and his camp would take a relaxed approach to the campaign, having breathed a sigh of relief when Gary Hart failed to secure the Democratic nomination. However, after a rare, lackluster performance by Reagan at the first presidential debate, questions surrounding his age and health would surface and provide Democrats with a sliver of hope. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at IntoHistory.com. Subscribe now at IntoHistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at IntoHistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at IntoHistory.com. It's October 21st, 1984, at the packed Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City. As the broadcast goes live, Dorothy Ridings, the president of the League of Women Voters, addresses the camera.
Good evening from the Municipal Auditorium in Kansas City. I am Dorothy Ridings, the president of the League of Women Voters, the sponsor of this final presidential debate of the 1984 campaign between Republican Ronald Reagan and Democrat Walter Mondale.
2 weeks earlier, Reagan and Mondale had debated at the Center for the Performing Arts in Louisville, Kentucky. Reagan had stammered through much of the night and lacked his usual charm in front of the cameras. Afterwards, many declared Mondale the winner, but Reagan was still ahead in the polls. So Mondale knows tonight is his best chance to catch up. An early question on foreign policy gives Mondale an opening.
Mr. President, in the last few months it has seemed more and more that your policies in Central America were beginning to work. Yet just at this moment, we are confronted with the extraordinary story of a CIA guerrilla manual for the anti-Sandinista Contras, whom we are backing, which advocates not only assassinations of Sandinistas, but the hiring of criminals to assassinate the guerrillas we are supporting in order to create martyrs. Is this not, in effect, our own state-supported terrorism?
No, and I'm glad you asked that question because I know it's on many people's minds.
The issue of Central America has been a thorn in Reagan's side ever since he took office. Back in 1979, a U.S.-backed dictator in Nicaragua was violently deposed by the Russian-backed Sandinistas. This conflict gave rise to counter-revolutionary forces, or the Contras. As part of his efforts to stamp out communist influence, Reagan supports the Contras in their fight against the Sandinistas. Many Democrats in Congress are concerned about the Contras' violent methodology and the CIA's alleged involvement. In his answer to the moderator's question about Central America, Reagan slips.
I have ordered an investigation. I know that the CIA is already going forward with one. We have a gentleman down in Nicaragua who is on contract to the CIA advising supposedly on military tactics, the Contras. And he drew up this manual. It was turned over to the agency head of the CIA in Nicaragua to be printed.
In this, Reagan has just made an astonishing admission by suggesting that the CIA is directly involved in training operations for paramilitary groups in Nicaragua. Before he can move on, the moderator asked Reagan to clarify.
Well, Mr. President, you are implying then that the CIA in Nicaragua is directing the Contras there.
President Reagan quickly tries to backpedal on his earlier answer.
I'm afraid I misspoke when I said a CIA head in Nicaragua. There's not someone there directing all of this activity.
Reagan goes on to explain that any actions that have taken place regarding assassination attempts go directly against his own executive order on the matter. If someone did go against his executive order, Reagan says he didn't know about it. Mondale sees his opening and pounces.
How can this happen? How can something this serious occur in an administration and have a president of the United States in a situation like this say he didn't know? A president must know these things. I don't know which is worse, not knowing or knowing and not stopping it.
Reagan tries to keep the debate focused on the economy, but the moderators won't let the subject of Central America and the Contras go. As Reagan refutes quotes that have been attributed to him in the press, questions about whether Reagan has misspoken to the media eventually lead to questions about his age and mental capacity.
You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Reagan takes a slight pause.
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
In the 1980 Republican primary debate with George H.W. Bush in New Hampshire, Reagan had seized the storyline with his now famous comment, "I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green." In the 1984 debate, he topped himself. The municipal auditorium broke into laughter and wild applause. The joke even got Mondale, and the two men shared a laugh on stage. The potentially damning statements Reagan made about CIA involvement in Central America would not make the highlight reel on the evening news shows. The great communicator demonstrated once more how effortlessly he connected with an audience and how he could use his powers of improvisation to reframe a conversation. Following the debate in Kansas City, there was almost no question in the national media as to who would win the election in November. Reagan's stumble in the first debate had only set him back a little, and now it seemed like there was no way for Mondale to catch up. Additionally, Mondale's pick of Mondale-Ferraro as vice president did not have the impact he and many Democrats hoped. After her debate with Vice President George H.W. Bush in October, polls showed that while most women believed Ferraro won, most men believed Bush was the winner. Prior to the debate, though, Ferraro got caught up in a web of political scandal. Ferraro and her husband, real estate developer John Zuccaro, had filed taxes separately. Ferraro had released hers, her husband had not. Several Reagan-friendly papers had accused Zuccaro of hiding ties to organized crime. Under mounting pressure in the media, Zuccaro had ultimately released his records. Though the taxes had not revealed any bombshells, Zuccaro would later plead to a misdemeanor for submitting fraudulent information on a mortgage application. Ben Bradley of the Washington Post suggested the attacks against the Italian-American Zuccaro were racist, saying, "I don't think the press would have put that kind of energy into it if we'd been talking about somebody called Jenkins." Years later, in an interview with the New York Times, Mondale would say, I don't say there's a double standard here. Every adult is responsible for their behavior. But I wonder if I had picked a male vice president, whether they had gone after the wife's records and finances and business in the same way they went after Ferraro's husband. In the final stretch of the campaign, Mondale continued to try to demonstrate that Reagan, through his economic and foreign policies, was only a president for wealthy white Americans. But this message didn't stick. Neither did Mondale's attempts to go after Reagan for the growing scandal in Central America. As a result, pundits took to calling Ronald Reagan the Teflon president, a man who survived controversy just as he survived a would-be assassin's bullet. Then, when Mondale made it clear he would raise taxes, his campaign and his political career was all but finished. He argued that Reagan would also raise taxes, but would lie about it. This accusation slid right off Reagan, too. When the election day arrived on November 6, 1984, few questioned that Ronald Reagan would win easily. However, most did not predict the absolute landslide that was coming. Ronald Reagan won 49 states. Mondale carried only his home state of Minnesota and Washington, D.C. The final count in the Electoral College was Ronald Reagan 525, Walter Mondale 13. Reagan's share of the Electoral College and his 58.8% share of the popular vote are the fifth highest ever achieved in a presidential election. Since 1984, no candidate has reached Reagan's Electoral College count. But despite the size of his victory, Reagan's coattails did not prove to be as long as they had been in the 1980 election. The Democrats picked up 2 seats in the Senate, and while the Republicans gained 16 seats in the House, it was not enough to take the majority. Republicans also lost several governorships across the country. To many, this signaled that it was Reagan who appealed to the American people, and not necessarily Reagan's brand of conservative Republican politics. While there was no question Ronald Reagan entered his second term with a mandate from the American people, some Republicans began to wonder what would happen to the party once the Gipper was gone. Across the aisle, Democrats were left to pick up the pieces and figure out how to avoid losing a third straight presidential election. Many in the party started to feel they'd lost touch with the concerns of the majority of Americans. Dick Lodge, a prominent Tennessee Democrat at the time, summed up what he saw as the Democrats' main issue. The perception is that we are the party that can't say no, that caters to special interests, and that does not have the interests of the middle class at heart. So figuring out how to appeal to the middle class and deciding whether or not to finally leave the New Deal Democrats behind and cede power to the burgeoning movement of the so-called neoliberals would become the major focus of the Democrats leading up to the 1988 election and beyond. The Republicans would start to look to their future, too. The idea of someone filling Ronald Reagan's shoes didn't seem possible, so they would focus on trying to make the man who had served with Reagan, Vice President Bush, more appealing to their base. Bush was a moderate at heart, but winning over the conservative wing of his own party would prove to be the least of Bush's concerns. Questions surrounding America's activities in Central America that surfaced at Reagan's debate with Mondale would soon snowball into one of the largest political scandals in American history. Along with President Reagan, Vice President George Bush would soon find himself having to answer what he did and did not know about a political scandal that would come to be called the Iran-Contra Affair. This is episode 50 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1984, the Teflon President. On the next episode, the election of 1988. Vice President George H.W. Bush is Ronald Reagan's heir apparent. But in order to defeat Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis, Bush must embrace Reagan's conservatism, get the best of a respected primary challenger named Bob Dole, and escape the shadow of what many call the biggest political scandal since Watergate. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Michael Federico. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
There's no escaping Murder Most Foul in my new weekly podcast, Rabia Chaudhry Presents The Mystery Hour with the Alfred Hitchcock and Ellery Queen Mystery Magazines. I'll lead you into twisty mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seats and guessing until the very end. Written by award-winning mystery writers, we bring you a new whodunit each week. Search for The Mystery Hour on your favorite podcast app and subscribe now to experience the thrill of the best mystery storytelling in the world and let the murder mystery begin.